Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to start a new series. I'm going to call it Woodworking 101. Very cliche, but that's what I'm going with. And it's going to be a series where we go through some woodworking basics. We'll go through one particular tool. We'll go through what you use it for, the different types of that tool, the accessories for that tool, and then we'll give a brief instructional on how you would use that tool, how you can be safe with that tool, to hopefully give you somewhat of a starting point to get going with woodworking. So if that sounds interesting, stick around and we'll get straight into it. All right, so what is a router? It is not that magical box in your living room that makes your Wi-Fi work and that everybody cries when it's down. In woodworking, a router is a tool we use to create grooves or profiles on the face or edge of a board. And in its most basic form, the router is essentially a motor that spins a bit. Similar to a drill, but with a lot more motor than spindle. Okay, so there's three main types of routers, and the most common is going to be your palm router. This is going to be the smallest router that you see in any shop. And from the base model, you're going to get a very small plate to reference off of. These are good for small profiling bits, and that's just about it. Profiling the edge of a board, a very small profile. They just don't have the base or the power to do anything of substance. Moving up from there, we have a fixed base router. This and the next one are going to share the same type of router motor. So the fixed base router, this one's actually attached to a router plate, so I can't take it off. But the fixed base router is a big brother, I guess, of the palm router. It's got a much bigger motor in it, usually somewhere between 1 3/4 and 2 horsepower, sometimes down by 1, but more than not, it's around 1.5 to 2 horsepower. And it's fixed base because you set the depth, and that is the depth. It goes at that depth and it does not change. This is also good for routing edge profiles, but can also be used with bigger, thicker bits to cut big dados into boards, assuming that you're safe and take multiple passes. Lastly, we have the plunge router. And the plunge router, exactly like the fixed base router, but you are able to plunge it directly into the material. It has a depth stop so that you can determine how deep you want to go. It's good to determine how deep you can get before you start, right, guys? But you can set the depth that you want to go, and then you can plunge in a little bit, make your cut, and then plunge in some more until you bottom out your depth stop. And that allows you to basically plunge into your material, like the name says, without having to set the depth and try and like carefully set the router down into the material to plunge it in, which is somewhat unsafe to do. Some skilled woodworkers could probably make that happen, but to plunge something in the middle of a piece of work is fairly dangerous because that bit is spinning at several thousand RPMs. So it's dangerous, and the whole router could just jump away from you. So those are the basic types of routers. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some common router bits. And two of the most common that you'll use, especially if you're starting out, you're going to be focusing probably on just edge profiles on maybe plywood edges, or the edge of a countertop, or the edge of a shelf, things like that. So two of the most common bits that you'll see are a roundover bit and a chamfer bit. The roundover bit, it does exactly what it says. It creates a rounded edge. Now, those come in a variety of sizes. So you can get micro roundovers that do maybe a 1/16 inch roundover, and then you can get roundover bits that do, let's say, a 1 inch roundover, which is quite aggressive. Next up, we have the chamfer bit. And honestly, when I was starting out, I had no idea what a chamfer is. A chamfer is essentially just a 45 degree. So most chamfers are going to be pretty mild, around a 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 to excuse me, a 1/2 inch. I don't know what happened there. But that's going to be sufficient to give you a nice look on the edge of, let's say, a desktop, or a shelf that works nice on a shelf, or the top of a shelf actually is probably a better use for that. Some other bits you may use when you're starting out include a flush trim bit, and these are useful for trimming something down to match another surface. So if you're doing a countertop and you need to put, let's say, a laminate top on the countertop, it's going to be very difficult for you to cut that laminate exactly the right size you need it. So you can overcut it a little bit, get it glued onto the surface with some contact cement, and then you can come back with this flush trim bit and trim that down to meet that surface edge so they're perfectly flush. Next, you have a pattern bit, which essentially works like a flush trim router bit. It has a bearing on it to follow your surface, but the bearing is on the top side. I guess the bearing's on the bottom side, I guess you would call that, of the bit. So it's meant to be used for tracing out a pattern on your hand router. Okay, so before we jump into the demo, I wanted to quickly show you some of the jigs that you might be using with the router. And the first one here isn't really a jig, but it's a way to upgrade the experience, in my opinion. This is a router plate. This one happens to be phenolic, which is, it's a composite material, kind of a plasticky material. This will allow you to mount most routers, most fixed base routers, to a base that you can inset into a work surface and make yourself a cheap router table from. Next, this is a design I actually stole, remanufactured, let's say, from a channel I'd been watching, Jenny and Davis. They are a couple that started a YouTube channel doing woodworking out of their garage many years ago. Have started a couple of businesses that seem to be doing pretty well. They are here on YouTube. You can check them out. They have some pretty decent stuff on there. This design here was made so that you could easily duplicate a handle for a charcuterie board. And this one here happens to be made out of, I'm drawing a blank. Not hardboard. What's this stuff called? MDF. This stuff is called MDF. Okay, this one here I haven't actually used yet. I found it on eBay. But essentially what it does is it is a jig for creating dovetails with your router by hand. Okay, quick disclaimer. You must take responsibility for your own safety. I take no responsibility for anything you try at home. You need to do your own research and read your product manuals for proper use instructions. What I'm going to show here today is what has worked for me in the past, and I'm going to show some basic principles of using the router, the safest ways to use the router, in my opinion, not my expert opinion, but my opinion. And that's all the legalese I guess I need here. So make sure to do your research on your particular tool. If you're watching this video to learn how to use a router, you're going to get some great details here, but maybe watch a couple other videos, not just one, but a couple. Make sure you're comfortable with how the tool is supposed to operate before you turn it on. Okay, so for the first step of using a router, you need to know which direction to run your material or which direction to run your router. If you're using a router without a router table, you're moving the router. If you're using a router table, you're moving the workpiece. So if you're looking at the top of the router, which is what you're going to see when you're running a regular router setup, the router bit is spinning clockwise. Okay. If you have it in a router table, it's spun 180 degrees and it's now rotating counterclockwise. That's important. So if you are hand routing anything, because the bit is spinning clockwise, you need to run this the opposite direction that it's spinning. And the reason you do that is because if you run it in the same direction as it's spinning, which is clockwise, it's going to want to run from you. So that is a very dangerous situation. They actually have a name for that. It's called a climb cut. And there are very few scenarios where you would actually need a climb cut, but it's not something I would recommend to anybody that has never used a router before. So for the purposes of today's video, we do not do climb cuts. So if the bit is spinning clockwise when we're hand routing, we're going to run our material clockwise. We're going to run our router around the material clockwise. This marker sucks. And that will make sure that the router doesn't try to run from us. Next, and this is specifically for hand routing, you either need to secure your workpiece physically with something, or you need to put some sort of non-slip under it. And this serves two purposes. First is so it doesn't move around on you when you're routing. Second is so that it spaces the material up off the surface. So if we put this under there and back it up from the edge just a little bit, that will prevent our bit from bottoming out on the surface of what our actual board we're routing is setting on. It's got a lot more space to work with now, and it's a lot safer. Next is your base. That's another important safety piece to this. So when you're running your router across this, you're going to want to keep this base as flat to the surface that you're routing as possible. So it's best to run any router base really, across a flat surface that's, let's say, at least 4 inches wide. That will give the base plate plenty of room to be stable on, and it will reduce the chance of tipping the router. So when we're running the router through, we're going to have that base seated on the surface, and we're going to be holding down on that base and keeping pressure on it to make sure that it doesn't do some of this when we're going. There's two issues if you come off of your surface. Issue number one, not super dangerous, it can gouge your workpiece. It will leave you an uneven edge. And I think in most cases, if you're using a bit that has a bearing, which and for the purpose of this video, the bits we use have bearings. It shouldn't really affect anything, but you'll have to reroute that section of board. The second issue, especially if you don't have a bearing, is that if you tip it up, there's a chance you could catch the blade weird, and it could again try and shoot the router towards you. And depending on how it comes at you and how far the bit is out, what kind of bit it is, that could do some serious damage. Next, you want to make sure that you never start the router with your bit touching your work surface. Again, for the same reason, it's going to try and rip the router out of your hand. I promise you, no matter how many reps you've done at the gym, this router is stronger than you are. So, and accidents happen faster than anybody can react. So not even Spider-Man saving you from this one. So what you need to do is get your work surface, get your base plate flat on your work surface. Make sure you have at least 1/4 of an inch space between your board and your bit before you turn the router on. If you're worried even more, if you're skilled enough, maybe not your first time around, but once you get some confidence, you can turn the router on and then slowly bring it in, set your base plate down, and then slide it into your cut to start your cut. So that's all there is to that. I just realized I have one more word of caution for you. Before you plug this in, make sure it's off. And to be extra safe, you need to lay this on a work surface flat where the bit isn't touching anything. And my suggestion, if you can, is to hold it in position as you plug it in. This will prevent, again, the runaway situation. If you had this laying somewhere and let's say it didn't have a bearing on it, even if it does have a bearing on it and it's touching something, when you plug that router in, if the power button happens to be on for some reason, got bumped or something, this thing is going to take off like a bat out of heck. So you need to keep your eye on that and be very safe with that. Don't forget your pee-pee. Pee. There you have it, the basics of routing and routers. It's not as scary as it looks. That bit is spinning fast, but as long as you take some safety precautions, like I said before, make sure you understand your tool, understand your material, the process that you're doing, it's not that bad. So hopefully you got some value out of this. As always, I'm your professional novice, James, and do me a favor, have fun and be inspired. Catch you next time.